The Paenitentiale Theodori is an early medieval penitential handbook based on the judgments of Archbishop Theodore of Canterbury. It exists in multiple versions, the fullest and historically most important of which is the Discipulus Umbrensium version, composed in Northumbria within approximately a decade or two after Theodore's death. Other early though far less popular versions are those known today as the Capitula Dacheriana, the Canones Gregorii, the Canones Basilienses, and the Canones Cottoniani, all of which were compiled before the Paenitentiale Umbrense, probably in either Ireland and/or England during or shortly after Theodore's lifetime. Background: it is generally accepted by scholars today that Theodore himself is not responsible for any of the penitential works ascribed to him. Rather, a certain associate of Theodore's name Eoda is generally regarded as the point of dissemination of certain judgments proffered by Theodore in an unofficial context and in response to questions put to him by students at his Canterbury school regarding proper ecclesiastical organization and discipline, authorship and structure. Capitula Dacheriana. Scholars have for some time accepted that the Capitula Dacheriana represents the earliest attempt to assemble together Theodorian penitential judgments. The case for the Capitula Dacheriana as an Irish production has been argued most effectively by Thomas Charles Edwards, who noticed, first, that the Capitula Dacheriana lacks any obvious structural framework. For Charles Edwards, this feature is symptomatic of the non-Roman character of the Capitula Dacheriana, and thus suggests its creation outside of Theodore's immediate circle and perhaps even outside of the Rome-oriented Anglo-Saxon Church. Whether or not this is true, there are other, strong signs that the Capitula Dacheriana was produced in ecclesiastical circles that had rather less connection to Theodore's Canterbury than with Irish and Celtic centres. Specifically, the Capitula Dacheriana has both textual and literary connections with 8th century Irish and/or Breton canonical activities. The Capitula Dacheriana is witnessed today by two 10th century manuscripts produced in Brittany. Ludwig Bieler has shown that the copyists of both manuscripts derived their text of the Capitula Dacheriana from the same 8th century collection of Irish materials that was still resident in Brittany in the 10th century, a collection that also included the Collectio Canonum Hibernensis. The recension of the Collectio Canonum Hibernensis, believed to have been compiled before 725, is the earliest work known to have drawn on the Paenitentiale Theodori tradition, relying on none other than the Capitula Dacheriana version. For this it appears that the Capitula Dacheriana was assembled perhaps as early as a decade after Theodore's death, and certainly no later than the first quarter of the 8th century. It was very possibly compiled in Ireland, and was used shortly after its creation as a source for the Collectio Canonum Hibernensis, which would itself go on to influence powerfully the developing canon law and penitential traditions in Francia. Canones Gregorii, Canones Basilienses, Canones Cottoniani, Paenitentiale Umbrense. The Paenitentiale Umbrense is a selection of canons from the earlier Capitula Dacheriana, Canones Gregorii, Canones Cottoniani and Canones Basilienses, along with additional Theodorian judgments that were obtained by a mysterious figure named Eoda Christianus, as we learn in the preface to the Paenitentiale Umbrense. These latter judgments were proffered by the Archbishop in answer to questions raised by rulings found in a certain Irish document, a work that is commonly believed to be the Paenitentiale Cottoniani. All of this material has been arranged by the author of the Paenitentiale Umbrense according to topic, with occasional commentary and additional rulings added in by the author of the Paenitentiale Umbrense himself. The Paenitentiale Umbrense is thus far far more organized than its predecessors, and owing to its contents derived from Eodia and the Libellus Scotorum, also includes more content that is strictly penitential in nature. The identity of the author is controversial. In the prologue to the Paenitentiale Umbrense, the author identifies himself as a Discipulus Umbrensium, a student of the Umbrians. Whether this identifies the author's nationality, or merely his academic affiliation, is unclear, and several interpretations of its meaning have been advanced. Felix Liebelman believed that the Discipula was an Irish disciple of Theodore, while Paul Fisterwalder argued that the Discipula was a man, Irish-born though trained in Anglo-Saxon schools, who worked on the continent, probably within the context of Willibrord's continental mission. A year after they were published, Fisterwalder's conclusions were roundly rejected by Wilhelm Leveson, who argued that the Paenitentiale Umbrense was the work of an Anglo-Saxon working in England. Scholars since have generally sided with Leveson in viewing the Paenitentiale Umbrense as the product of Anglo-Saxon England, and more specifically of a student working in Northumbria. The Paenitentiale Umbrense survives in two forms, a full form and a half form. The full form is clearly the more original work, the half form being simply the last 14 topics or chapters of the full form. The full form itself survives in slightly different versions. In the earliest of these, the work is divided into 29 chapters. These are 1. On drunkenness, 2. On fornication, 3. On theft, 4. On manslaughter, 5. On heretics, 6. On perjury, 7. On diverse evils, and on actions that are not culpable because necessarily or accidental, 8. On the ways in which clerics can do wrong, 9. On those who should be defrocked, and those who cannot be ordained, 10. On the twice baptized and how they made a penance, 11. On those who do not honor the Lord's Day and hold ecclesiastical fasts in contempt, 12. On Eucharistic communion and the sacrifice, 13. On the public reconciliation of penitents, 14. On penance specific to those in Christian marriage, 15. On the worship of idols and demons, 16. On church administration and church building, 17. On the three principal ecclesiastical grades, 18. On ordinations, 19. On baptism and confirmation, 20. On the Mass for the dead, 21. On abbots, monks and the monastery, 22. On rites performable by women, and on the ministry in the church, 23. On different customs among Greeks and Romans, 24. On the communion of the Irish and British who do not keep Easter the tonsure according to Catholic custom, 25. On the mentally ill, 26. On the use and avoidance of animals for food, 27. On questions pertaining to marriage, 28. On servants, 29. On diverse questions. A later version of the full form has these 29 chapters divided into two books, with chapters 1 to 15 comprising the first book and chapters 16 to 29 comprising the second. Up until recently, scholars had assumed that the two-book version of the full form was the original version of the Paenitentiale Umbrense. Accordingly, all previous editors have printed the two-book version, and all previous scholarship has been predicated on the assumption that the author of the Paenitentiale Umbrense created a work divided into two books. Several scholars even claim to have detected a generic division between the two books, noting that many of the subjects covered in the first book are those typically associated with the penitential genre, while many of the subjects in the second book are those typically usually dealt with in canon law collections. It has been supposed that this is because the author of the Paenitentiale Umbrense wished to divide the chapters of his source material into those of a penitential nature and those of a canonical nature. However, it now seems more likely that the more noticeably penitential nature of the first 15 chapters is due not to the author's specific desire to front-load his work with exclusively penitential material, but rather to his decision to incorporate into pre-existing collections of Theodorian canons the newly acquired canons obtained from Eodia, is described above. The material that the Discipulus had managed to obtain from Eodia was based largely on Theodore's responses to rulings found in the Paenitentiale Cottoniani. All such material from the Paenitentiale Cottoniani is indeed found in chapters 2 to 14 of the Paenitentiale Umbrense. The highly penitential nature of chapters 2 to 14 is therefore merely an accident of the Discipulus's decision to treat first those subjects touched on by his Eodia Paenitentiale Cottoniani material, namely the traditionally penitential subjects of fornication, theft, manslaughter and marriage. Beyond this there was apparently no attempt on the part of the Discipulus to treat penitential subjects in the first 15 chapters and canonical ones in the last 14. Indeed, the last 15 chapters treat several subjects aligned strongly with the penitential genre, for example food avoidance, marital relations and mental illness, while Book 1 contains chapters dealing with subjects more commonly associated with canon law collections, namely baptism, heresy, and ordination. Neither do the sources used by the author of the Paenitentiale Umbrense give any indication of a generic division between its first and second halves, for a great many canonical sources are drawn upon in the first half. It now seems that in its original form the Paenitentiale Umbrense was a 29-chapter work and that the two-book version was a later development. The earliest manuscripts, which also happen to transmit the oldest textual variants, witness to a work divided into 29 chapters, while it is only two later manuscripts, which also contain patently more recent textual variants, in which the Paenitentiale Umbrense appears as a work divided into two books. It is also now clear that the passage from the prologue commonly used to defend the idea that the work was originally divided into two works has been misinterpreted. The prologue runs as follows, with the relevant portion in bold. A student in Northumbria, humbly, to all Catholics in England, particularly to the doctors of souls, salutary redemption in Christ the Lord. First of all, I have, dear, held it a worthy enough thing to lay bare to your love's blessedness, whence I have gathered the poultices of this medicine which follows, lest through copyists' decrepitude or carelessness the law should be left hideously confused, which God once, in a figurative way, handed down through his first legislator and ultimately to the fathers, in order that they might make it known to the sons, so that the following generation might learn, namely penance, which the Lord Jesus, after being baptized, proclaimed to us, having no medicine, as above all the substance of his teaching, saying, do you all penance, etc., who for the increase of your felicity deign to guide, from the blessed seat of him to whom it is said, whichever things you set free upon the land will be set free also in the heavens, him by whom this most helpful salve for wounds would be concocted. For I, the apostle says, have received from the Lord, and I say, dear, with the Lord's favor I have received from you even that which I have given to you. Accordingly, the greater part of these Eodia, the priests of blessed memory, known to some as Christianesses, is said to have received under instruction from the venerable Master Theodore, and these are buttressed by what divine grace likewise delivered to our unworthy hands, things which which the aforementioned man came to learn from a widely known Irish booklet, concerning which the elder is said to have given this opinion. An ecclesiastic was the author of that book. Many others also, not only men but also women, enkindled by him with an inextinguishable passion for these, in order to slake the thirst, hurried with burning desire to crowd round a person of undoubtedly singular knowledge in our age, whence there has been found among diverse persons the diverse and confused digest of those rules, composed together with established causes of the second book, on account of which brothers, through him who was crucified and who by the shedding of his blood confirmed what mighty things he had preached while living, I beg your love's most obliging kindness that, if I have herein perpetrated any misdeed of rashness or negligence, in consideration of the utility of this you defend me before him with the merit of your intercessory prayer, I call upon as witness him, the maker of all things, that in so far as I know myself these things have done for the sake of the kingdom about which he preached, and as I truly fear, if I do something beyond my talents, yet may the good intentions of so necessarily a work seek from him pardon for my crimes, with you as advocates, for all of whom equally and without jealousy I labor, in so far as I am able, and from all of those things I have been able to select the more useful and compile them together, placing titles before each, for I trust that these things will draw the attention of those of good soul, concerning whom it is said, peace upon the land to people of good will. The context makes it obvious that the Libri Secundi highlighted in bold above refers to nothing other than the Scotoran libellus mentioned several times previously. There is thus no need to suppose, and no evidence to support, that the Discipulus composed his work in 2 books. The 2-book version most likely arose under the influence of the canon or collection known as the Collectio Canonum Vetus Gallica, is mentioned above. The Paenitentiale Umbrense survives in a full form, and in a half form, so far as can be determined. The half form first arose in Corby between 725 and 750, when the Vetus Gallica collection was undergoing revision and expansion. Those responsible for revising the Vetus Gallica had not long before acquired a copy of the Paenitentiale Umbrense, which they decided to include in the revised collection. For whatever reason, the Corby revisers were interested only in the final 14 canons of the Paenitentiale Umbrense, and it was these canons alone that they included in the appendix to the Corby redaction of the Vetus Gallica. Thus began the tradition of the half-form version of the Paenitentiale Umbrense. The Corby redaction of the Vetus Gallica was very successful, and very soon after its creation it was enjoying wide circulation in France, Germany, Bavaria and northern Italy. As a result, far more copies of the half-form version of the Paenitentiale Umbrense were read and copied, either as part of the Vetus Gallica appendix or as part of derivative canon or collections, than ever were of the stand-alone a full-form version. The 2-book version of the full form probably only developed after the half-form had achieved popularity, that is, in the second half of the 8th century or first half of the 9th, since by then most who knew the Paenitentiale Umbrense knew it only in its half-form version. Someone who happened upon the full form would likely come to believe that he had found a fuller version of the Paenitentiale Umbrense, and of course they would be right. However, so used would they be to viewing the last 14 chapters as a discrete unit that they would insist on dividing the newly discovered full form into 2 books, with the first 15 chapters comprising a welcome new addition to the Theodorian corpus, and the last 14 chapters comprising the already familiar half-form. They would perhaps also have been helped along in the decision to introduce such division by the mention of Libri Secundi in the newly discovered prologue. Future copies of the now divided full form would preserve the two-book format. Centuries later, similar assumptions would be made by 19th and 20th century editors, who come to accept as original the two-book format over the 29-chapter format. In 1851, Hermann Wasserschleben would be convinced by the large number of manuscripts containing the half-form of the Paenitentiale Umbrense, as well as by a single 17th-century epigraph of MSC exhibiting the two-book format, that the work must have originally been composed with two distinct parts. He was therefore persuaded to ignore the evidence of his two earliest manuscripts and print the Paenitentiale Umbrense with a two-book format. Subsequent editors would base their editions both on the two-book text as established by Wasserschleben and on those manuscripts that were closest, or that seemed most ancient to them. These were MSV5 and MSC4, both of which happened to present the Paenitentiale Umbrense in two books. The textual tradition of the Paenitentiale Umbrense has not been studied closely since the work of Österreichische, and so the evidence for their assumptions about priority of the two-book format have gone unexamined. Some copies of the full form contain a prologue, while others lack the prologue but contain an epilogue instead. No extant copy contains both the prologue and epilogue, a fact that led Österreichische to conclude that the epilogue was not original, but was only a later addition intended to replace the prologue. Wilhelm Leverson countered this argument by demonstrating that the prologue and epilogue share remarkably similar style, and therefore must have been composed by the same individual. He also pointed out that the prologue is clearly an original part of the Paenitentiale Umbrense because c. 7.5 of the text refers to it directly, and there is also an oblique yet obvious reference to the prologue in the first sentence of the epilogue. The presence of the prologue and epilogue in some witnesses and not in others can be explained without resorting to hypotheses about different authorship or about the priority of one and the posteriority of the other. Of the 6 witnesses to the full form, all have the prologue except W9 and V6. V6 is fragmentary and preserves no part of the Paenitentiale Umbrense except the epilogue from Eruditus Illa onwards, while W9 probably once contained the prologue on a folio between fols 1V and 2R, and this folio has since been cut away. W9 and V6 are also the only 2 witnesses to contain the epilogue. Yet, in each of the other 4 witnesses the absence of the epilogue can be explained. Both WZ2 and V5 are fragmentary at their ends, and so may have once contained the epilogue, while both CB4 and W7 have simply replaced the prologue with copies of the Libellus Responsonum so as to make the latter seem like part of the former. It has recently been argued by Michael Glathar that because the epilogue refers disparagingly to certain heretical beliefs associated with 2 of Boniface's most hated opponents, Adalbert and Clemens, it is most likely a later addition by Boniface or someone in his circle, while the very strong arguments put forward by Leverson for the originality of the epilogue render Glathar's view of the entire epilogue as a Bonifacian document rather unconvincing. There is no reason that Glathar's argument could not apply specifically to those parts of the epilogue that discuss the heretical beliefs of Adalbert and Clemens. Such discussions are confined entirely to the second half of the epilogue, which in fact reads more like an epistolary dedication than an epilogue, and so may very well be a Bonifacian edition. The Fulda recension, manuscripts and transmission. There are numerous extant manuscripts that contain the Paenitentiale Theodori parts thereof. The following tables divide the extant witnesses into Umbrense versions, non-Umbrense versions, and excerpts. Umbrense versions are further divided into full form and half form. The sigla given below are based on those established by the Canones Cottoniani editions project for the Corpus Christianorum, Series Latina, Volume 156, a project whose goal is to produce scholarly editions for all major early medieval penitentials. Sigla in parentheses are those used by Paul W. Fistrewalder in his 1929 edition. Umbrense versions full form 29 chapter version 2 book version half form non-Umbrense versions excerpts. Note that reports of the presence of Paenitentiale Umbrense and or Canones Gregorii excerpts in the 10th century Collectio 77 Capitularum as found in Heiligenkreuz, Stiftsbibliothek MS 217 and Munich Bayerische Staatsbibliothek CLM 3853 are in error. What such reports are actually referring to is the penitential known as the Capitula Dacheriana. The following table summarizes the manuscript distribution of the several versions of the Paenitentiale Theodori. Summary of manuscript distribution. Fistrewalder further divided the witnesses of the Paenitentiale Umbrense into two classes. Of the earliest manuscript witnesses, namely those dating to the end of the 8th or beginning of the 9th centuries, none originate in England, the supposed place of origin of the Paenitentiale Theodori. This is not unusual, however, since many early insular texts survive today exclusively in continental witnesses. The majority of extant manuscripts of the Paenitentiale Theodori originate in either Burgundy, northeastern France, and the region of the Rhine and Main rivers. This is significant, as it is these areas in which the Anglo-Saxon mission, specifically that part directed by Boniface, operated in during the first half of the 8th century. The manuscript evidence may thus reflect an early transmission within the scribal centers in the area of this mission, and so may indicate Anglo-Saxon involvement in the Paenitentiale Theodori's early dissemination throughout and or its introduction to the continent.